Hey folks, I am Doug. I am here to introduce Camela Thompson and Joe Jose Schattschneider. Joe is from CaliberMind. He is a senior consultant marketing data strategy. What does that mean? That means that it is his job to clean up the messes we're going to talk about today. Quite often he's doing it with large enterprise customers. Joe is also the nicest guy in the world, probably the best person for this type of job, considering how much pain you have to go through. Joe, thanks for joining us today. We got Camela Thompson. Camela, guys, you probably all know Camela. She is a RevOps expert. She is a chapter leader for RevOps Co-op, and she's the head of marketing. She's also the former VP of marketing CaliberMind. It was my great distress to replace her. Those are big shoulders to jump up on top of. I am Doug. I'm a fractional CMO helping out at CaliberMind for the last year or so. We're going to be talking about why marketers don't understand their Salesforce metrics. There is a guide, a companion guide that goes along with this. You'll see a QR code at the end. You will find me in the chat, probably referencing you to that guide because there's so much content we're trying to cover today, and a lot of it is covered in the guide. Cam, I'm going to give it over to you. I'm going to be monitoring the chat, looking for questions, and I will be asking questions when I can during the presentation. So, Camela, your show. Joe, good luck today.
I love being put on the seat, and everybody knows I love interrupting people. So please interrupt me back. You should get even for other folks. So anytime you have questions, please jump in. So, what we're really talking about today is an epiphany I had moving from sales operations to marketing operations and realizing that the systems aren't at all the same. And then also working with the people and getting exposure to how they think about the data. So I'm going to start with the psychology behind some of this, and then we'll feature Joe much more heavily as he has a lot of recent experience rolling up the old sleeves and slogging through this data conundrum. So I really want to talk about how the execs view the world. Then we're going to talk about what the teams need to do their jobs functionally. And then we'll talk about how the data is structured because it's very different. And this is all relevant because you're going to need to sell the new way to do things in a way that doesn't threaten what the CMO is trying to do or what the sales team needs to get their job done. So it's really important to know their perspectives. So the CEO really cares about two things, profitability and growth. And just about anything else you throw in there can go into one of those categories. So what they traditionally focus on is very finance accounting oriented, and they really want this view of for every dollar you put into a channel, how many spit back out at me, how soon, because they want to understand how their investment in marketing is working. On the other hand, the CMO, they care about these things too. And ultimately, we're trying to align our tactics with the overall company strategy. But what we're really focused on is how do we get 8 to 10 people on a buyer committee engaged throughout the funnel, not just at the very top, but throughout. So we're dealing with thousands of interactions, hundreds to thousands before they ever contact sales. So I think Forrester's research is 90% of the buyer journey doesn't take place with a salesperson. A lot of that, the vast majority, is digital. And that may not be on your website, but they may be seeing ads on different sites. They may be interacting with like third-party peer review sites, all those good things. And then the VP of sales, they want to hit their number now. They're not really concerned about what marketing is doing to impact future numbers. They want to know they can hit their number now. They know that multiple quarters missed aren't tolerated. By the way, the marketer knows that too because they're under the same pressure. And then they really want to focus on attainment and at bats or the volume of leads so their sales team is fed. These are all words I hear straight out of their mouths. So like I mentioned, marketing interacts with the world a little bit differently. We have to think in terms of thousands of interactions in different places and meet the buyer where they are, and they're all over the place. So focusing on one thing to scale a business just doesn't really work. Sales, on the other hand, they think of the world as an account, an engagement, an opportunity. So instead of, I know they deal with the buyer committee, I know they're dealing with a lot of people and selling to them, but ultimately they're selling to the account, and that's a logo. Sometimes they're selling to departments and multiple segments within an account, but generally we're talking about account versus lots of people, lots of interactions. And then customer success, their goal is to really prove the value of your products. Their best interest is to interact with multiple people at the account, but they think of the world even differently than the sales team. I've worked in a lot of organizations and I was customer success ops a while ago, but they thought of everything from the lens of what kind of products does this customer have and what do I need to support, as opposed to the account person. So we all kind of look at the world a little bit differently, and we need to. And our systems look at things differently too. So Joe, really want you to jump in here. I know you deal with a lot of data schemas. If you could really kind of focus on what makes marketing automation and CRM so different.
Yeah, I think just the general data structure across a CRM and a map is very, very different. Thinking about like Marketo, I regularly struggle to translate Marketo into a language that is similar to that of a Salesforce like campaign member, particularly. Marketo is going to look at things, at a program level, but then break down into campaigns that are kind of, in my mind, more like tactics or like a step in a playbook. And that granularity just does not, I guess, correlate well to what you're doing in Salesforce. So that's a very common example where you can have one of your tools speaking really a completely different language than another tool, and when you try to mesh those two together, you're going to start to run into some problems.
Well said. And I think from a user's perspective, marketing really wants to track every single interaction because they're under pressure to prove how each channel works. So they want to get all those interactions in there. They don't care if it's a website page visit or if it's a form fill. I mean, they do. They know the difference. But ultimately, we're trying to prove the value of each function. And a lot of times that's equated with we need to link directly to pipeline and bookings. And that's really hard to do for something like a content writer. The other thing going on here is that the sales team, they really just want to know, what did this prospect do that warrants me reaching out to them in a way that ties to their odds to convert? So the way they think about this is the CTA or the asset they interact with versus what did they click on to get there? So marketers are under a ton of pressure to prove that their digital advertising spend is worth it. So they tend to focus on the ad. The salesperson doesn't really care if they clicked on a LinkedIn ad. They would rather know, did they request a demo or did they download some content? Because the probability of those two things converting are very different. So they need to know the context and what the prospect will remember versus what drove them there. Now, as we go through this, I want people to keep in mind that we're still going to capture both, and we're still going to acknowledge marketing does need to prove the advertising spend. We're just changing how the data is structured so that they get both. And it's surfacing what the sales team cares about the most, which is what's the thing they did that I can talk to them about that might get them to convert into an opportunity. So the biggest lie Salesforce has told marketers and anybody who's dealt with really complex account hierarchies, healthcare, automotive dealerships, anything along those lines, that one of the most painful aspects, hierarchies. So you get this nice visual where it looks like everything's really neatly organized. We have this structure, but when it comes to actually reporting in Salesforce, you're actually very limited on how many layers you can go down. So Joe, I put an example up here of what I've seen in terms of campaign hierarchy. Can you kind of explain some of the layers, and then maybe I'll get into the marketing automation piece a little bit?
Yeah, and this is a very real example. I've seen campaign hierarchies like this at many enterprise clients, and it's really using the campaign object as a foldering mechanism, I'd say, to provide what I would consider as metadata type information. And so in the example here at the very top, we're using North America. There's going to be another for EMEA and for any other region that you're potentially looking at. You're narrowing that down into usually like an asset or potentially like a go-to-market motion. But then you're going down further into the actual, the channel or the interaction point that brought them in. And this creates, as you can see, a complex hierarchy. I mean, we have 4 layers here. I've seen some go all the way to 5, 6, even 7 layers. And that's a lot to manage. It's kind of scary to look at, and it creates a lot of trouble under the hood.
Yeah. So this one goes all the way down to the ad level. And what I see a lot of, and this is going to span Marketo, Pardot, Eloqua, HubSpot. I've worked in all of them integrated with Salesforce or Dynamics. And what tends to happen is folks really well-intending set up automations in their marketing automation system to determine which UTM parameters are associated with the form fill, and then push those records into the campaign that ties to the UTM parameters. So the UTM parameters are what the person clicked on to get there, if it's available. So a lot of times they'll have something like LinkedIn ABM ad 123. And that's what shows up as what triggered this into an MQL for the sales team or marketing qualified lead. Well, the salesperson would probably rather know, was it a demo request? What kind of form did they fill out? Were they just downloading content? So instead of going down to the ad level, the salesperson would rather know, well, what were they trying to get and what were they interested in? Because that really tells them which product line are they interested in? What kind of business is this? What kind of use case? So the other problematic thing here, like Joe said, it's just the more layers you create, the more difficult it is to report within the application. Now, can you stand up a data warehouse and make all of this work? Absolutely. It's going to take extra work. And because everybody does it a little bit differently, and I think Joe would agree with this, it just makes it complicated to standardize and find a solution that works for everybody if you do it that way.
Yeah, I think this introduces a lot of complexity for marketing ops users as well. I mean, whenever I see a hierarchy that's complex like this, there will be campaign members across every level of that hierarchy. And that just becomes very challenging to, interpret what is going on, who's interacting where. Even pulling it into a data warehouse can make it very challenging to report on. So unless you're using this hierarchy perfectly, you're just introducing more risk and more reporting challenges.
So can I add a question in here, Camela and Joe? Good.
Yeah.
So Teresa is asking, shouldn't that additional information be available rather in other UTM parameters? Great question.
So what I'm going to recommend is not UTM parameters, but custom fields on the campaign object. So the link URL information, we'll get to it. What we're going to advocate for is a very flat data model, meaning that a lot of the categorization that they try to do with the campaign or CTA level, we're going to move to the campaign object itself. And then the UTM parameter information, we're actually going to recommend moving that down to the campaign member, and we'll explain why there's a benefit to that. It does require a lot of work in Salesforce flows. It's totally possible. And it will really simplify how the data is structured and get your marketing team better visibility into how those ads are actually working. So we covered this pretty effectively. We talked about how messy it is when it comes to reporting on different levels, and that the sales team doesn't want to know about LinkedIn ad 123. I do want to step back and talk about how marketing thinks about all of this, because having been a marketer and marketing ops, it's very different than how the rest of the company thinks about it. So when we're thinking about a major initiative that's very expensive, like a trade show, we're not just thinking about the trade show. We're thinking about all the things we need to do to drive people to interact with us at the trade show. So we're thinking about LinkedIn ads, web banners, newsletters, targeted emails to people we know are in the area or typically attend this sort of thing. And then we're also trying to get them probably to an event that's near the event or the trade show, because that's where we know we can have the most in-depth interactions and let salespeople spend a lot of time just getting to know these people and build relationships. So there's going to be a lot of outreach driving them to that in-person event in addition to the trade show. Doug, do you want to add anything here since you're the marketing expert?
No, I think you've nailed it, Camela. And this is a pretty good sort of summary of exactly how we're thinking about a trade show and all the different interactions we're expecting to see and be able to report on.
And there's money spent at all of these levels, and we need to track it and we need to prove that it's working. So I understand why marketers want to put it in little discrete spots. So sales in the rest of the company, the reason why I say they only care about what's in the pink dotted box is because this is what's going to tell them the person's proclivity to convert. So if somebody stops by the booth and we're giving away swag and they allow you to scan their badge, that's much less meaningful than if they spent an hour at a dinner networking with everybody. I think the person who is engaging with you on a more personal level is probably, you might get lucky and strike somebody when they're in market and they know about your product. Odds are greater, though, that those in-person interactions are going to be more fruitful. So what the sales team cares about, they don't care that they clicked on a LinkedIn ad to find out where our booth was. They want to know, was their badge scanned? And did they go to the after party? So what I want to point out is marketing is not going to lose any information in this. What we're actually recommending is at the campaign level, you are creating custom pick lists to help organize data that's used over and over. So what I would think about here is region. That's a pretty standard marker. Why are we using a parent campaign when we can have an indicator for region? Think about how we structure our accounts. And it's not that marketing ops is trying to make things more complicated. We don't talk very often about how our systems work. I only figured this out because I spent a lot of time in marketing automation systems after I spent a ton of time in CRM working directly with salespeople. So understanding how differently the data is structured and how the different teams need to see the data is super critical. The only exception to allowing parent campaigns is an initiative that spans multiple campaign types. So that would be like a trade show with all those other buckets. You would have like, I don't know, what's a huge AWS 2025, and then you would have your LinkedIn ads and everything else under here. And then you would have like notifications on your campaign member, whether they requested a demo. You would see a lot of different activities under that umbrella. So what I want people to think about, though, is really using those custom pick lists when it comes to if your team likes to track the type of industry they're selling into, a theme of messaging they're trying to use, or a specific audience that they're trying to track. If they're creating campaign hierarchy levels for those things, put it in a pick list. So the other half of this is those UTM parameters we were talking about that come in the form. Instead of building complicated programs, automations, it depends on which system you're using, the terminology they use. But instead of using really complex automations, like in HubSpot, I can see this in my mind where we're branching out and pushing them to different campaigns based on the UTM parameters within a parent campaign for the asset. Instead of doing that, we want to push that information to the campaign member via the leader contact. So traditionally, a lot of companies that I've consulted with, they push the UTM source medium channel campaign onto the leader contact record. And then they would stop there. And that was highly problematic. So I understand why we started doing child campaigns. What you need to do is actually set up a flow to check for the most recent campaign, the timing, and if it's relevant, push those UTM parameters down to that campaign member. And what that does for you is it allows you to keep a running record of what kind of UTM parameters people are engaging with. And if you have persistent UTM tracking, or you can see you have some kind of cookie mechanism that stores those UTM parameters as they move around the website, you can actually see how that campaign played out in ways that marketers didn't expect. And this happens all the time. We try to push them to download an asset. They click around the site. Maybe sometimes they go, oh, this is actually really relevant to me and I'm going to request a demo. Wouldn't you want to know that that ad did that? I would, as a marketer. So Joe, what would you add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great practice. Within CaliberMind, we have almost a separate object that we call a channel, which is really taking this UTM information and providing an output, a calculated output of what that channel is. So I think this really replicates that well. And what's really valuable with that is, you now have almost two separate data points that you can compare against each other, being the campaign, which I always think of as it's the asset that was interacted with. And then, this campaign member information, these UTM parameters, which really represents the how that individual got to that asset. And now you can run, numbers like what channels, what UTM parameters are most prevalent in our best performing campaigns. It provides just a new level of information that is really hard to get to if you don't set things up in this way.
Right. And as a marketer, I know that I'm spending in kind of two dimensions. So I'm spending money to get them to the thing, and I spent money on the thing that was created or is happening. I want to look at the cost of both of those things when I figure out how much that lead costs to acquire. I don't want to just look at the one dimension. And that's really, really complex unless you're storing the data like this.
Can I ask you
Doug,
guys a bit of a potentially curveball question here?
yeah.
This is really interesting. Somebody has experimented with creating a UTM object related to context and campaigns. Everybody can see this in the chat. Is that something you guys have done before? Custom objects, UTM-based objects, and would you recommend it, or would you say stay away from it?
Joe, I'm going to let you go after I say I tend to stick to standard objects as much as possible. The reason being the campaign member is already acting as a discrete interaction indication. So the person saying, hey, I'm downloading this document and I can stamp the UTMs on there. I can see a benefit to doing it the other way if the person comes in multiple ways and doesn't interact the first time. So if you're trying to capture all of those touch points, one, good luck, because it can get pretty expensive in terms of data storage, but I understand why you do it. And I think it's not a bad idea. It's just not how I think about allocating attribution. When I think about attribution, I want to allocate attribution to the meaningful touch points that could indicate they could convert, as opposed to all interactions. But I'm a little weird that way. Joe, what would you say?
Yeah, I haven't worked with any clients that have implemented such a thing, but I can definitely wrap my head around the value of it, and I think it's interesting to explore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Definitely not a don't do. I don't think I'd recommend it based on how I think about attribution, but that doesn't mean I'm right.
Hey, Camel, I have a question for you on the screen here.
Sure.
I regularly see clients that use the campaign name and they crowd in, 5 or 6 different, I'll describe as metadata as well into that campaign name, usually pipe delimited, the region, bunch of different things.
Yeah.
I guess, what are your thoughts on that approach?
I always coach marketers not to do that and to use the custom pick lists instead to indicate those things. The reason why is I want the marketers to think of this as communicating with sales and telling sales why they should follow up in the campaign name, because usually they're going to see the campaign name and the member status. I would rather they focus on here's what the sales team did, or sorry, here's what the prospect did, and here's why the sales team should follow up on them, than the details that only my department would care about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to agree. It's, I love your approach of it is stakeholder management. And I think the sooner you can think about your stakeholders and implement in a way that supports them, the less you're going to have to change or backpedal later.
Okay, so here's why I would, if I could sit down with RevOps people and coach them just a little bit, this is why I really want RevOps to care about this. And this is why I'm such a big advocate of RevOps managing marketing, sales, and customer success operations. It is so critical to cross-pollinize the knowledge that you have about how different executives think of the data and how it's structured and functionally accessible in the applications your team uses to do reports. I really, really want folks to think of this as a way to help marketers have their cake and eat it too. they get all the data they need, and they're also improving the experience for the salespeople, which can impact alignment really positively, especially if what converts is based on the asset or thing that they're doing. And you can suddenly use that information to figure out how something's converting instead of focusing on the UTM level. Because what you're going to notice is if you focus on the UTM level, your conversion rates are going to be all over the place. And that's because you're driving people to do different things. Focus on the thing that the person's doing. Sales is smart. They know that that's how they can figure out whether or not this person's worth talking to. But keep that information so that marketing can prove that their advertising budget is paying off. So we need to do both things, but we need to think of how the different departments think of this and how the executive team wants to report on it. But if you take away one thing, it's focused your campaign name on what the salesperson needs to effectively follow up. So, for example, we have LinkedIn ad 1235. Tells me nothing. I don't know what they actually did. It's not useful as a salesperson. If instead I did demo request for attribution, salesperson knows exactly what to do with that. So that's how I want to think about not only the campaign name, but what I'm creating campaigns to capture. I'm not creating campaigns to capture the UTM data. I'm creating campaigns to capture what that person requested to do with the business. Joe, would you add anything here?
No, not really. I think this is a great example. And it goes back to working with sales and making sure they have the data that they need to perform.
So here's some campaign best practices I would love everyone to know and work with their marketing operations person or their marketing team to also educate them about this. So like we said in the prior slide, the campaign should communicate which action and how likely that action is to convert to sales, which means when you analyze the campaign type and conversion rates against that, they should be much more meaningful, and you should have a much better idea of how different activities convert. So trade show, badge scan versus download. The campaign member captures how that person arrived at the action and what they did. And marketers don't always know to think of it this way. They try to cram all of that in the campaign name and put them in discrete campaigns because they don't know there's a member status. They don't use it regularly. And a lot of times they don't standardize it across the different campaign types, and it gets really messy. So here's another area you can add value to the marketing team and marketing operations by teaching them member statuses matter. And that's what we want to use to indicate what exactly the person did with the asset, the trade show, the in-person event. And then flat structures, data structures, make in-app reporting easier. So apply the same logic you use for accounts to campaigns. Sometimes we need a hierarchy, I get that, but we often look for any other way to manage this than hierarchies because we know how painful it is to report on them. Use that same logic with the campaign object. Use custom pick lists as much as you can. UTM, campaign member, or the custom object. And then we don't need to push every interaction into our CRM. This is where my opinion is a little bit controversial, but a website interaction or page visit isn't as valuable to me as a demo request. And it's not going to be as valuable to the sales team. So I think it's really important to tell marketing, I realize everything you do is critical. The website's the hub of everything we do. Everybody lands there. However, we need to think about what the sales team needs to know and act on as campaigns in our CRM. You can track all of that in your marketing automation platform. Again, we view it as valuable, but we're going to blow up our Salesforce data expenses if we capture every website interaction in there. So Joe, agree, disagree? Doug, feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, I agree with all of these. I really do want to emphasize the importance of data consistency and data standardization, especially with enterprise customers that I work with. Campaign member statuses they're going to be tens of thousands of different statuses, slightly, misspellings, slightly different terminology, and all of that just kind of lessens the value of your data. So anything you can do to march towards consistent statuses, types, will really help with your analytics and reporting.
Question about the exception, and that's ABM, which I understand sort of intellectually, but curious why we sort of break that rule. So just at the bottom here, it says the only time we recommend using a parent campaign is for an initiative like ABM, where there are multiple, it says campaign types, but I'm going to sort of interpret that as saying multiple campaign types that represent multiple different channels or tactics.
Right.
Why do we sort of slip there? Like, why is that important to potentially break that rule?
All right. So if we just kept ABM play as the campaign, and that came across to the salesperson, they would have no idea why they're following up with them and what they did, because an ABM play typically spans upper to lower funnel. We start with ads, we move on to like email plays and a bunch of other things. What the salesperson really needs to know is, did they download the high value offer that you created, this cool PDF that people can download? Or did they request a demo? Or did they just download a white paper? Because each of those things is going to mean a different level of interest. And it could indicate exactly what they're interested in, because we may be going after this big account, but they may be interested in engagement instead of attribution, some other product family. So we really want to think about the lower campaigns as what they did that would be of interest to the sales team, but we do want to wrap them up into that ABM initiative, because whether we're using Salesforce in one parent level, we can get to the data there, or if we're using a database, but we want to really limit the number of parents, grandparents, et cetera.
So this could be applied to any sort of multi-channel, staged, if you will, campaign. And what I'm hearing from you, Camela, is that quite often ABM campaigns have an engagement focus at their core.
Yep.
Where we're looking at going after, let's say in the case of enterprise selling. This is usually, by the way, the benchmark for this is, for whatever reason, if your deal size is say 50K or above, you're talking about buying units, meaning 5, 6, 7, 10 people, quite often with a budget holder, influencers, all that fun stuff. And so you wouldn't necessarily jump all over some aspect of an ABM campaign just because somebody showed interaction early on in the process. The idea is that I'm trying to get that business unit going, which sort of leads to a really good question here, which is, with everything we've talked about up to this point, this is interesting. I have not heard a lot of commentary on Einstein AI and its predictive capabilities. So I'm super curious to hear what you guys are going to say about this. But the question is, how does Einstein AI affect the recommendations you're making? And especially as it applies to predictive analytics. In other words, are we free from really great meta structures and campaign hierarchies and campaign structures because of Einstein sort of interpreting that question? What do you guys think?
It's not there yet. So it doesn't really impact my recommendation, because at the core of this, we're trying to communicate to the sales team what they need to know. And Einstein shouldn't be taken into account when we decide what the campaign member and response trigger or qualified trigger is to get the sales team involved. So what I want to challenge people to do is think about usability and function for the people actually using the system first, and then branch out to analytics that can support that. I just think, from what I've seen, I understand AI's applications with unstructured data. I think it can eventually be really powerful, but we still need to have things tied together in a way that makes sense to the end user, and that's easy for that AI application to learn from. Joe, you have more experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. And leaning again into the data standardization side of things, garbage in, garbage out has been a thing forever. It is so much more important when working with AI, whether that's Gen AI and LLMs or any algorithmic approach to anything. The importance of good standardized data is ever more important now. So following these steps, being consistent and establishing a strong process is going to help your usage of Einstein just be more powerful.
Yeah.
I have a feeling the question was asked because this person has had some success with Einstein.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, I'm putting words in Duran's mouth here, but I would say that I had a lot more luck with LLMs and Gen AI well before it started making its way into products, including CaliberMind. But I have to say, like, I will tell you, sort of our job is to lag what you're experiencing in LLMs. Our job, meaning enterprise platforms. We have security issues, we have data privacy issues, all those things. I'd be super curious to ask this question a year from now when some of those problems are solved about how AI is sort of making up for, let's face it, even companies that are meant to be pristine with their data structure. Joe, you and I work on this all the time. Like we work our butts off to make sure we're pristine. We still slept, right? So, being able to put sort of large language models on top of that to interpret data, sometimes is a decent shortcut. So I'd say let's not conclude that it's not helpful, but I would say I agree that garbage in, garbage out, it's always a problem.
Yeah,
You don't want
I
your
mean,
AI trying to interpret it.
whether a human's doing it or AI, it's all about pattern matching and recognizing anomalies and consistencies. And if you don't have consistency in your data and you're kind of all over the place with how you're structuring your campaigns and you're not optimizing for the end user, you're creating harder work for that AI. It's going to take longer to learn. It's going to be less reliable. So,
Yeah, I agree.
yeah. Okay, so an example of a solid campaign, I'm using the parent campaign. One thing I did want to say about parent campaigns is the use case I would not use a parent campaign for. I have a client who's trying to expand into the US. I would not have a US expansion initiative. I would have a region pick list and I would have US as the target. So I would not think of parent campaigns that way. The reason why is that gives me room to do things like ABM plays and different multi-channel marketing tactics within that without losing visibility into those more important parent-child layers. So we have a content download as the type, ABM high value offer download. So the sales team should be working closely with marketing whenever it comes to ABM, or it's not ABM, is my opinion, hot take. And they should know what that means. Hopefully. Doug, you're smiling. You look
I
like
agree completely. I rarely agree with you on everything, but I completely agree. I think this is really solid structure, and I have to say we never had the pleasure of starting a Salesforce implementation from the ground up, but guess what? We always had the opportunity to update our campaign approach, and I really agree with this approach.
And good news, I have applied this to historical data. The thing that gets tricky is if you don't have UTM data stored anywhere consistently, and then it gets harder. So if you have UTM data and it's on the contact and lead object and you have history tracking, you might be able to wrangle this all together. But focusing on educating marketing on what sales cares about the most, having that be at the campaign level and really flattening out your data structure, you can achieve that. And I've worked with clients over 90-day engagements, 60-day engagements where we've accomplished this. And Joe has done it in less time because he has better tools than I usually have access to. Joe, how long does it normally take to sort through all of this stuff? Like figuring out the hierarchies?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, it depends on the complexity. Best case scenario, if it's like a 3-layer hierarchy, it can be fixed in a couple of days. But like I mentioned earlier, I've seen up to 6 and 7 layers, and that becomes very, very complex. I've actually developed, kind of tying back to your parent campaign comment earlier, but I recommend to clients, my best practice is, if you think of the parent campaign as a folder, you get one folder. You can folder a campaign one time. So don't waste it with a United States initiative when that can be used as metadata, because you're only going to have one folder to use.
I'm really curious because I know we've got a little bit more to cover, but Joe, have you seen folks using the campaign object and budget tracking and actuals tracking as a sort of hack to ROI, or because I saw that for years and years, or is that sort of gone to the side?
Yeah, definitely. And that also requires having a campaign setup that is consistent, and
Right.
it's much, much easier if you don't have a lot of layers to look through and to add up. And how do you cascade down a hierarchy with cost when it's up at a higher level? So ROI is a very, very good use case for having a consistent, simple campaign structure.
I will add, though, that what complicates this is the digital ad layer at UTM level. So what I always recommend with clients is they track the advertising platform's campaign ID so that we can integrate with that platform and pull the expenses in that way. And then just focus on the campaign object on the actual cost of the asset or the event or the interaction. So we can layer in that digital advertising spend too. But because what I tend to see is people are shocked by how many places people go from this UTM parameter and actions they take, that it's going to be spread across more campaigns than they expect. And the best way to get to that data is to have them put the campaign ID in the UTM parameter and then capture that down to the contact lead and then campaign member level, or the object, the UTM object.
Yep, totally agree.
Okay, so this does work in app. Wanted to point out that if you're using like a campaign member report, you can have your campaign parent, your campaign, and then you can pull in fields like audience. And then across the top, you could put something like UTM channel or campaign or whatever you need to see. So it makes it possible to report on both of these things at once, predictably and reliably in app. So the trick to making this all work is to download the guide, because the guide goes through all of the different flows, because you'll need multiple to make this work. So the way I've set this up in the past is we have a flow that pushes the contact UTM data to the campaign member, and we have to do a flow for contact and a flow for lead. And we're looking, I also use a UTM fields and then copy UTM fields so that I can see when it's done and not have it continue to cycle through it. So there's an end to the program. And that's not going to make sense with me talking about it here as much as it is in the guide, because it details each trigger, decision, step, all of that stuff is in there. So I would recommend downloading the guide for that. And then I've seen a lot of organizations just store it at the lead and contact object. Like I've mentioned a few times, that gets overwritten a lot of times, or you've got a ton of fields. I see this in some HubSpot instances, and we're not really talking about HubSpot as a CRM today, where we just have tons and tons of custom properties that you can never delete, and your database kind of blows up. The real struggle in Salesforce and Dynamics is if you're going through the history object, it can get really hard to sort the logic out and get things appended to the right thing if you have history tracking on. And I rarely see it on, so that data is gone. So that's why I wouldn't recommend that. Joe, do you want to add anything here?
Just totally agree with you. I think adding it to the campaign member gives you one spot to look at to see, again, the asset, the what, and then the how being the UTM parameters. So don't make it messy trying to tie into the history table with your campaign member responses. Just keep it all in one place.
Sweet. So here's the guide. I think we're also going to drop it in the chat. It's titled Salesforce Admin's Guide to Campaign Setup, I think.
That's right. And yeah, so it's in the chat. You've got the code here. You can scan, folks. One thing I'll say is I hate it when marketers gate stuff. So this is ungated. We want you guys to have access to this. We want to see lots of clean campaign hierarchy setups. Are you guys ready for your first question?
Yes.
Okay, so this is we've got a few coming through, but I delayed this because I think this is a really good sort of broad or general question, and this happens a lot as organizations. I talked about sort of that ACV and making this transition from selling to people and selling to buying units, or to an individual rather than selling to buying units. So the question here is from Neha. She's got a healthcare client that is making the transition from MQLs to MQAs, and it's
cool.
a nightmare. Yeah. It's a nightmare. And what she's asking for, they're asking for here is it's a nightmare to group in HubSpot and reconcile with Salesforce. Been there, done that, especially leads and contacts.
Yep.
Any suggestions from you guys?
Yes. But Joe, do you want to take this first before I start rambling?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to say something that's really controversial. I don't like lead scoring and using that as the qualification method. The reason why is I prefer to keep it really simple and tied to the action they're taking. Yes, I do believe there should be ICP fit as well, and that can be layered in your MQL logic. So that's the first hurdle. I know I'm talking about MQL and you're talking about MQA. I'll get there, I promise. So the first hurdle is really simplifying how you look at qualification and getting agreement with the sales team. This isn't something you can do independently. Once that's done, then the data can be aggregated at the account level, and it is complicated. And I've done it. CaliberMind does it for you, which I preferred, because it typically, the way I've had it work best is if I do the calculations in the data warehouse and push it back, but that's too much time. That's a delay for the sales team. So you have to figure it out with flows, and that's kind of a nightmare. So I think what I would recommend is really simplifying your qualification method and setting up really straightforward guidelines about rules of engagement and when to raise these things to the salespeople again, or else it's going to be really confusing. The reason why I say that is if an account is qualified and somebody else fills out a demo request, which happens all the time once sales is engaged, somebody else wants to see the product too. You need to figure out a mechanism to let them know about that without overriding your MQA date and pushing it backwards if the sales team has done any work on it. That's a tough one. I wish I had better advice for you, but simplification is often key to making that work in terms of what's qualified and what isn't.
I'm just going to
and lead
say
to
that
account matching. Lead to account matching. If you don't have that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
You just took the words out of my mouth, Camela. So there's lots of great tools out there. Lead Data is probably the best known, lead to account matching. It's built into a lot of their applications as well. I think Chili Piper does a good job of it. CaliberMind has it built in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic stuff. Joe, any thoughts there with regard to that transition MQL to MQA?
Yeah, I've worked with a couple enterprise clients on that transition. Thankfully, they were using CaliberMind, which I think definitely streamlined the process for them. But what they all ran into was an expectation from the sales team that the previous lead scoring was going to somehow translate to this new account-based scoring where, if 3 leads interact and do this, that was good before, and that's going to be good now in the account space. But you're really looking at things very differently. You have a lot more data available to you when you look at it in account level. So I think kind of echoing what Camela was saying, it's good to almost re-baseline, reset, work with your sales team, and almost use it as an opportunity to refresh your scoring model.
And I would highly encourage people to keep the contact level structure in place and that integrity to remain where it is and put the indicator at the account level. And here's why. The salesperson needs to quickly identify who exactly took the action and what it was with. So if we update everybody as qualified, it's going to make it really hard for them to dig in and do the research. So please put the qualified account indicator at the account, leave the contacts alone, unless it makes sense to, if an opportunity is created, maybe we close out those open leads that weren't addressed. I don't know, but please consider keeping it at the account level so the person can do the research, figure out who did what.
Fantastic, folks. Thank you. Let's get over to hot takes. And so, yeah, here we go with hot takes. We're going to start with the least controversial Spanish German from Iowa. Joe, hot takes?
Yeah, I think my hot take from all of this is that at its core, RevOps is an important piece of RevOps is stakeholder management, without a doubt. And the sooner you have those challenging conversations and you get alignment and you establish those processes, the sooner you can make these changes or implement in a way that'll allow you to be successful. But communication is key, just like any role, but it can't be lost here.
All right, Camela, try not to be too controversial today. What's your hot take?
Instead of a hot take, because I do those all the time, Feisty Fridays, find me on LinkedIn. Instead of a hot take, I'm going to give folks advice. And when you're looking through campaign data, which I want everybody to do, keep in mind the best intent was behind what was done. So don't assume that they did things to make things difficult or because they didn't want to understand things or they didn't listen to something. Always assume that people are trying to accomplish something meaningful figure out what that is and how to accommodate it. Don't assume that they're twits and they don't know anything. Like, you've been in the system all the time. You understand the data structure and how it works. They're trying, they don't have the same access to the system. So it's your job to help them get where they need to go.
Good stuff. I'm going to tell you, folks, I was really fascinated by the question about Einstein, and I think that's there's a broader thing happening that I'm seeing with my clients, which is quite often they are very frustrated by the lack of good data that helps them answer questions, and they're starting to load stuff into their large language models, seeing it all the time. I think that's a really good shortcut, folks. I would agree with Camela and with Joe. Data structures are important first because you're leaving a large language model to interpret a lot of could potentially be bad data. But just a couple of tips here. So I'm going to, like Camela, not a hot take per se, but make sure you're subscribed and make sure that as you're loading data, it is not data that's being consumed by the larger language model when you're doing that stuff, because otherwise it gets taken up. I am the dummy who started doing this back before I realized that was a challenge. So just don't do that, please. I'm waiting for some of my data to show up in 3 years in a presidential speech. I think it's going to happen. All right. Well, folks, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Joe, Camela, it's always so great to be talking to you guys.
Thank you.
I will mention one more time, the guide is out there. Camela was the author. I think it's a really great way to sort of dig into a lot of the detail that we just couldn't possibly cover in 45 minutes of content. So thank you to RevOps Co-op. Thank you to CaliberMind for sponsoring today. And thank you for our panelists for being here.